When Lomita started getting a little bit bigger in size, they decided they needed a fire engine instead of the old bucket brigade. So they did a fundraiser and they purchased the 1917 Model T Ford.
It was great.
It's an American LaFrance double tank chemical car. So it's soda and acid. It's simple and easy to use because these were volunteer firemen. It went into service 1921 to 1925, early 26, and it was run by Charlie Smith, who was a deputy fire warden, and he was a businessman in Lomita, and Hugo Schmidt, who was the butcher in town. Those two were the entire volunteer fire department for the city of Lomita back in those days. When they went to store the firehouse, they actually stored the fire engine between the community center and the bank, and then the lumber company in Lomita donated the lumber, and they built basically a roof, 2 doors, and a back, and they used the 2 buildings as those 2 walls. And that's where they stored the Model T fire engine. Keep in mind, Lomita's a smaller city, and it doesn't look like what it is today. Buildings are spaced further apart. But story has it too, when the city was smaller, the fire engine didn't start. I always ask people, how did they start it? How did they get to the fire? And you got to keep in mind what Lomita looked back in the 20s. And story has it is they backed a horse up, put a hitch over the front axle, dropped a pin through it, then they could tow, if the Model T didn't start, they could tow it to the fire. So things were much simpler back in those days. Volunteer, it was in service from 1921 to 25. That iconic photo on the curb, somebody wrote in 1921 to 25. I think it was maybe in service, until maybe early 1926. When the city got bigger, so they had to say, hey, we need to get better fire protection for the city. So then they built LA County Fire Station 6. While LA County Fire Station 6 on Lomita Boulevard was under construction, today it's on Narbonne Avenue. That moved there in, I think, the early 60s. While the firehouse was under construction, they actually stored the 1925 American LaFrance at Myers Garage. And there's pictures of Myers Garage. You're going, why are there pictures of Myers Garage? But if you look over the doorway, it says fire warden. So it was temporarily housed there until the construction was complete at LA County Fire Station 6. My grandfather, Captain Frank Laski, was the first fire captain in Lomita, and my dad grew up right next door. So my dad told the story many, many times. He says when he got old enough, growing up next to a firehouse and being buddies with all the firemen. But when he got old enough, he would hear the alarm go off at LA County Fire Station 6, which was right next door, and he'd go running next door, and my grandfather, he'd go, no, you're not going on this one, and Elton, just stay there. Or he'd wave him on, and my dad would jump on the rig and go to fire. So he was a fireman much longer than he was on the department. So my grandfather, Captain Frank Laski, he was with LA County Fire Department from about 1926, 27, and he retired in 1949. They had a little photo session with the Model T, and they parked in front of 2244 Lomita Boulevard at the corner of Moon Street. And Lomita Boulevard looked much different back in those days. And you can see in the background, of course, the cars from the period. So they had a little photo shoot with some of the, looks like battalion chiefs and others from the fire department. And so some great photos from 1949 when he retired. Another iconic photo is they actually lined up 3 generations of fire engines at at his retirement in 1949. So they had the 1917 Model T Ford, which was volunteer. And then they had the American LaFrance that we was on most of the time. And then they had just added I think it was early, or 1949, I believe 1949, it was called General Pacific Fire Engine. So they had all 3 fire engines all side by side. When the Model T went out of service though, neighboring Walteria came to the city of Lomita and said, hey, can we borrow your Model T? Fireman Lomita said, sure. So Walteria borrowed it. One day, Lomita, about a year later, and the firemen were sitting around the firehouse, and they're going, gosh, what happened to our, Walteria still has their Model T. So they went to go get it back. It had 4 flat tires. They don't think they ever used it. It was in disrepair. And then my grandfather, Captain Frank Laski, turned to Charlie Smith, the deputy fire warden, and said, hey, Charlie, I'll give you $25 for the Model T. So Captain Frank Laski purchased it. He stored it for a long time. My dad said he used to play on it when he was a kid. And eventually my grandfather, I think he wanted to start it one day and it wouldn't start, and he got frustrated. He goes, if you can get this out of here in 10 minutes, you can have it. So my dad got some buddies in Lomita, and kind of like the our gang, and they shoved it into the garage in Lomita and stored it. He used to play on it. And then when he returned from the U.S. Navy in the 50s, there was a frame up, what they call frame up restoration, probably around 1956. And that's where you take it down to the bare frame, every nut and bolt. And that was the first frame up restoration for Lomita's first fire engine. It desperately needed. It was, my grandfather paid $25. It was pretty run down and needed some tender loving care. So he brought it back to life. And there's pictures of my dad in the garage, and you can see where he's sitting in it, but you go look at it close and go, no, the water tanks aren't there, and the fenders are missing. And so, but there was a picture in the newspaper in Lomita back, Lomita's first fire engine ready to roll type article back when he got it running. And then my dad, he, after living next door to a firehouse at LA County Fire Station 6, he actually went on to Redondo Beach Fire Department for a few years, and he left there and he went to Los Angeles City Fire Department, and he was on LAFD from 1957 to 1988. And when you're in a firehouse and they know you have an old Model T fire engine, they asked my dad, hey, can you bring the fire engine to fire service day at a firehouse? Can you give the chief engineer a ride in the Hollywood Christmas parade? It was even on Queen for a Day TV shows as a prop on stage. It was Fireman's Night, so they just had firemen's wives for that particular episode. We have hundreds of pictures from when he was with Los Angeles City Fire Department, and a lot of pictures that we have are nice 8x10 glossy black and whites. When you flip them over, on the back they have property LAFD. So back in those days they had staff photographers. But we're very fortunate. We have pictures from back in Lomita days, and also a long history of pictures when he was on the fire department. And then mom and dad, my brother and I, Mark, were born in the early 60s. And there's some iconic photo where dad said, okay, he had our little pedal cars, and their fire engine pedal cars, and he even made ladders for us out of a frame for aluminum, a screen door, put wooden rungs, and my ladder and Mark's ladder would hook together. We could climb and go over a 6-foot block wall. I'm sure Mom was happy about that. We're sitting on our fire engine pedal cars on the driveway, and Dad got some old turnout coats from the firehouse, and he cut the sleeves off in the bottom because they were too long, and we had our helmets on. And then Dad's, of course, sitting behind the wheel of the Model T in the driveway. So a great photo. And kind of going back to that era too, one day we were out in the garage, and we're tinkering around as we did day in and day out. And my dad smelled smoke. And he goes, hey guys, I smell smoke. And we go, yeah, we do too. So we went out to the opening of the garage and we looked up, and we could see smoke coming up. And by the smell of it, you could tell it was a grass fire. And Dad turned to us and he goes, do you guys want to go to a fire? We go, yeah. And we were so excited. And we hurriedly put on our helmets and turnout coats, and Dad turned on the air compressor and put about 100 pounds of pressure into the tanks to pressurize it. And we started up the Model T. We pulled up to the intersection at 228th and Normandy. And just on the other side is the LA City Strip. So Dad was an LA City fireman, so that was LA City Fire. And we could hear fire engine 85s from Harbor City coming down the strip to go to it. When we got to the intersection, my dad turned to me and says, okay, Carl, blow the siren. So we pulled in behind engine 85, and the engineer and my dad knew each other, and he knew the fire engine, the Model T. And the engineer turned to my dad and he goes, hey, Laski, is this your idea of mutual aid? And my dad says, hey, can my boys put out some fire? And he goes, yes. I'm about ready to get my hose burnt. He goes, have them lay a line in there and squirt some water. And so my dad did it on purpose. He took the hose basket is behind the seat. He took the nozzle out, and the hose was like a coil, a big old spring. So I was on the nozzle. My brother Mark is about a year and a half younger, and he's behind me. And my dad goes, "You guys ready?" I go, "Yeah, Dad, we're ready." And we're all braced. And he did it on purpose. And he turned the valve on really quick. And it charged the line. And I went flying one way and Mark went flying the other way. And he did. And after my dad and the engineer on Engine 85 got a good laugh, he straightened the hose out and then walked behind us and we were squirting water. So after that, we'd see a big billow of smoke coming out. "Dad, let's go to that." He goes, "No, no, no, we're not going to that one." My only regret is because it was spur of the moment, there was no pictures, there's no cell phones back in those days where you can easily shoot video. So just a great memory though. And just like my dad, where he played on the fire engine, we played on the fire engine too as a part of our lives. Every New Year's Eve, we say, "Dad, can we blow the siren at midnight for New Year's Eve?" And he goes, "Well, if you guys can stay up that late, sure, let's do it." Whenever he would take it out too, it was a magnet for the kids in the neighborhood. He grew up in the baby boomer area. There were so many kids on our block. And every time my dad started up to take it somewhere, there was a line, go, "Can we go for a ride?" And so he'd give some people, kids a ride. It's been a part of the family for a long time. And we're just very fortunate. We have hundreds of pictures for the history over the decades. But Dad did another frame-up restoration from 1978 to 1983. It was a 5-year restoration. And the radiator was leaking. That's what started it all. It was just really bugging him. And next thing you know, the fire engine is just completely torn apart. And by that time, I graduated from Narbonne High School in 1978. So by that time, Dad had free child labor. And so my brother and I were teenagers, and he had us sandblasting and wet sanding for your body work. We were all involved in the project, but my dad did a fantastic job. And he had the eye for detail. He was a perfectionist, and you look at it nowadays, and it shows. And I give credit to during that frame-up restoration, Joe Gasser of Gasser's Garage actually did the engine overhaul. So it was that engine was set over to Gasser's Garage, and my dad had to wait patiently for Joe to work on it in between other projects in the garage. My dad and Joe Gasser grew up together. When my dad acquired the fire engine when he was a kid, though, Dad told a story where one of the pistons was frozen. It just wouldn't crank over. It wouldn't budge. So my dad went to Merle Gasser, Joe Gasser's father, and he goes, "Merle, what do I do?" He goes, "Elton," and he says, "just take off the head, pour penetrating oil in each cylinder where you see the top of the piston, take the oil pan off on the bottom, put a piece of cardboard or something underneath." And he goes, "When you see drips of oil, you come see me." So he did. So Merle Gasser had a hand in bringing that engine back to life. Back in the, who knows who it was with the 40s or whatever. And then Joe Gasser redid the engine in, probably the early 80s. So there's a great photo of my dad and Joe Gasser in the San Pedro Centennial Parade in 1988. I was standing on the sidewalk and I took the picture. It was so fun to see both of them. My dad, of course, driving the Model T, and Joe Gasser going for a ride in the parade. Lomita's first fire engine has been in so many car shows, displays, a lot of parades. There was a lot of parades here in Lomita back in the day in the early 60s. Something I'd like to see again. But there was a lot of good old-fashioned parades. Good photo of my dad and one of his friends, Pete Perda, going south on Narbonne Avenue, and you could see Boy Scouts walking down Narbonne Avenue and an old police motorcycle, and of course other old fire engines behind it, and looking north up Narbonne Avenue. So a lot of good photos and a lot of good memories. The fire engine has a long history. We're fortunate to document it. What motivates me is I still look at Dad owned this for decades, and he painstakingly 2 frame-up restorations to restore it. And both my grandfather, Captain Frank Laski, and my dad both have a hand in preserving and restoring the Model T. Dad passed away in 2015. I really think my mindset is this is still Dad's fire engine. So I'm just Dad's engineer, mechanic, and historian. So whenever I take it out to car shows just so people can enjoy it, they can see it, they can take pictures. Years ago, it was probably going back to 2012, I actually came to Lomita City Hall to a general meeting for the Lomita Historical Society. And they invited me, and I did a PowerPoint presentation, and I opened up the family photo album, which is what I'm doing here, opening up the album to share with everybody. Why keep it tucked away in a shelf? So I did a PowerPoint presentation, and at the very end of the presentation, I closed the PowerPoint, I clicked on this icon on my laptop, and it was discovered at a Narbonne High School reunion, where people took pictures and old film and said, "Oh, here you're doing for the reunion," and somebody submitted this old film. And my dad was at the reunion with Joe Gasser, and Joe Gasser goes, "Elton, you got to come see this." And my dad's watching this loop go around. They had it in a loop, and he goes, "Joe, what am I watching? What am I looking for?" He goes, "Oh, you'll know when you see it." And next thing you know, you see the 1917 Model T Ford fire engine, and you see the 1925 American LaFrance that Captain Frank Laski was on, and you, of course, no sound, and you can see my grandfather and my dad talking to each other, and you see this little boy with a fire helmet, and they pull out of the firehouse on Lomita Boulevard, and they go do a little lap around in Lomita, and my grandfather and the rig, they back into the firehouse, and they go, "Where's the Model T?" And the camera pans around, and the Model T stalled. So they got my dad out, his little boy. They sit him down. Somebody gets out, cranks it, and they get back in and they drive up. And my dad was just blown away. And so I had that little clip at the Historical Society. They invited me back about a year later, and they were nice enough to present me with a storyboard and the history of the Model T, and very nicely done. And I use it at car shows and displays. And everybody's taking pictures and looking at it. And I looked at the president of the Historical Society, Steve Yanko, and I said, "Steve, I got a question for you." He goes, "What's that, Carl?" He goes, "Are we just going to stand here and look at this, or are we going to start it up and go for a ride?" And he goes, "Are you kidding?" He goes, "Yeah, let's do this." It was very rewarding that day because there was, I think, two relatives of Charlie Smith, the deputy fire warden. They were there. So they got to sit in Charlie's seat. So and that's what makes it so fun. So whenever I do car shows and displays, just to share the history of just the Model T itself, but also the fire engine and its history. So I've told the story many, many times, and it's just fun to share, fun to show photos. I even keep a little photo album with the fire engine so I can flip through, and it's a lot of the pictures of iconic one of Charlie and Hugo, and also my grandfather's retirement in 1949. So I have that photo album I can flip through and share a lot of photos. So, and even back in 2000, about 2012, I was coming from a car show or somewhere in the South Bay, and I stopped by LA County Fire Station 6, and I told him, I said, "Hey, this is Lomita's first fire engine." He goes, "I'll tell you what," he goes, "I'll have you come back and meet the captain." So I went through the firehouse to the apparatus floor, and then back is where the kitchen area is, and they said, "Oh, this is Carl Laski," and I looked around and said, "You guys want to see Lomita's first fire engine?" And they all jumped up, and they had to come out to the curb. I had it on a trailer, and after one of the parades here in Lomita in the early 60s, Dad took a series of photos in front of LA County Fire Station 6. And I really wanted another updated picture of that. So I was prepared to ask really nice, "Hey, would you mind if I pull the fire engine off the trailer, back it in the driveway, and take some pictures and tell them the story that Dad took pictures about 50 years earlier?" Before I could ask, the engineer goes, "How hard is it to get it off the trailer? Because I'll pull the rig out and you can back in the driveway." And it was so much fun because you had all these firemen, and firemen are a bunch of big kids. My dad was too. At one point they said, "Okay, let's run into the firehouse," and they all got their turnout pants, and we had a little photo shoot on that day, and that was fun to see. And then Squad 6 actually got a call, and I got a picture of Squad 6 pulling out right next to Lomita's first fire engine. And it was fun just to get update, current photos almost 50 years later. I've had a lot of fun with it. It is a labor of love. It's a lot of work to when say, okay, it's time to take it out for a car show display. You have to shine the brass and the chrome and make sure the old fire engine starts. I've had some mornings where, okay, but it's a little tough to start. I'll never complain about cranking the Model T. Because if you think back in the days when Model Ts were prevalent, I can't imagine trying to crank start a Model T in Chicago, Buffalo, New York in the wintertime. So cranking a Model T out here in sunny Southern California, I don't complain about it. Lomita's first fire engine was never in service with Los Angeles County Fire Department, or used at Fire Station 6. It was never stationed there because it was just volunteer. However, there's a story, and one day there was a brush fire up in Palos Verdes, and if it squirted water, they took it. So LA County Engine 6 went up to the brush fire. Well, they also took the Model T up there because it squirted water. Well, the only problem is my grandfather, Captain Frank Laski, drove the Model T back to Lomita. We don't know if he was coming down Hawthorne Boulevard or Crenshaw. We know they were steep today, and they're still steep back in those days. Model Ts do not have modern brakes like we do today. No disc brakes, no drum brakes. There are ball bearings in the front axle. There are some brake shoes in the back, but those more like think of a parking brake when you pull this lever back when you park it. Model Ts use a band in the transmission to slow down. So there's 3 pedals on a Model T. The left is push it down, it's low gear. In the middle is neutral, all the way out is high gear. The middle pedal is reverse, and the right pedal is the brake. And when you push that, it's using a band in the transmission. So Captain Frank Laski was driving this from the grass fire up in Palos Verdes. He's coming down either Hawthorne or Crenshaw Boulevard, and he is terrified, going, I sure hope I can stop, because you've got the weight of the tanks and probably leftover water in the tanks. And he was terrified coming back to Lomita, just going, oh, this could end badly. So he was, white knuckles on the steering wheel of the Model T. So that's the fun old days of fighting fires. So you can say it was never in service with Los Angeles County Fire Department. That's absolutely correct. But you can honestly say it was pressed into service. So it did go to a fire on behalf of LA County Fire Station 6. There is a book, and it's called, I forget who wrote it, and I do have it, on hard drive. But somebody went back in the days, because the first 10 years of Los Angeles County Fire Department. So you had all these cities back in those days in the 20s, and just like Lomita went through, it says, okay, well, before the Model T, we didn't have a fire department. Somebody's house caught on fire, your neighbors all bound together, and the old bucket brigade. City gets bigger, you need a Model Ts for some, but it's still volunteer. And there's a lot of cities across the United States, even today, that have volunteer fire departments. The city becomes bigger, and then they have to get full-time fire service. Somebody did do a great history of the early and all the cities all over this area that eventually became had say, hey, we need a LA County Fire Department. We need some coverage here. So, but it's and I believe there's a portion in there for Lomita too. Now, I always tell people when I'm at car shows and displays, and I show them the picture of Hugo and Charlie sitting behind it. I go, look in the background. The nearest building is probably 50 feet away. Today, houses are so close together, like 10 feet apart. So if your house catches on fire, the radiated heat, eventually it'll start to catch the house next to it. So the fire department rolls up nowadays, and for the first things they look is, well, we have to attack the fire. Well, first of all, safety if somebody's trapped, but also protecting exposures. But back in those days, Lomita, everything was just, there's just fewer people, fewer buildings, and everything spread out. So back in the days in the Model T, I just wish we had some pictures of the Model T actually at fires. We don't, no known pictures. There is a picture of engine 6 at a fire where you can tell they're pulling a hose off a reel. Probably only one I have of them actually had a fire back in those days. Simpler times but fun times too. So fond memories of visiting my grandma at corner of Lomita Boulevard and Moon Street. Two little boys get bored really quick, and my dad or my grandma would say, "Here's a couple dimes, just loose change." And we would actually walk down to the dime store. And I have fond memories of that when I was a kid. And my brother and I are like two kids in a candy store. And yes, we come back with candy and a whole batch of other stuff that we didn't need. I always say Lomita back in those days was like, the old Andy Griffith show, Mayberry RFD. It was a small town. Everybody knew each other. We could just go walk down the sidewalk, and we were a short hop away from the dime store. So that's what I remember as a kid, visiting grandma, and then walking down to the dime store, and that was always a treat for us. And my dad, when it was because it was small, when he goes, okay, I gotta go fix some stuff at his mom's house, at my grandma's house, and okay, while I'm here, I might as well walk down the corner and get a haircut at the barbershop, which I believe was on the corner of Lomita Boulevard and Narbonne. So when you were getting your haircut, you're looking, you had a panoramic view of that intersection. So, and my brother and I would sit in that barber shop and wait while Dad got a haircut. So I lived in fun time. That's my memory of good old Lomita back in those days.